Never meant to open that envelope. It had been sitting in the pile on my kitchen counter in Sudbury for 4 days, mixed in with a flyer from Canadian Tire and what turned out to be a dental reminder for an appointment I had already missed. I was having my second coffee of the morning, standing at the counter the way I do, when I don't feel like sitting down, because sitting down means settling into a day I'm not ready to face yet. I almost swept the whole stack into the recycling bin. I almost did, but something made me flip through it one more time, and there it was, a Hydro One statement, forwarded from my son's address up on Lake Temagami. The billing period was 2 months. The amount owing was $312. I set my mud down very carefully. The cottage was supposed to be empty. Let me tell you about my son, before I tell you about what happened next. Because you need to know who he was before you can understand what it meant to lose him. And you need to understand what it meant to lose him before you can understand what I found. Thomas was 36 years old when he died. He was the kind of man who would drive 3 hours each way to help a friend move, show up with a rented truck and a bag of Tim Hortons, and refuse to take gas money on the way home. He was a structural engineer who had his mother's patience and my tendency to take things apart to see how they worked, which made him methodical in a way I always admired but could never quite replicate myself. He had bought the property on Lake Temagami 6 years before he died, because he said Northern Ontario was the only place he felt like the world slowed down enough to think. He loved the quiet up there, the loons in the evening, the way the light came off the water in the morning before anyone else was awake. He died 19 months ago on Highway 11 north of Huntsville. A transport truck drifted into his lane in the early morning in February. Icy conditions. The investigating officer said Thomas likely didn't have time to react. They closed the file within 3 weeks. It was ruled an accident. I was 64 years old, and my wife Margaret had passed from a stroke 2 years before that. And when Thomas died, I became the kind of alone that you don't have a word for in polite conversation. He was our only child. There is a particular silence that comes with that. A silence that fills every room of your house, whether you are in it or not. And that follows you into the grocery store and into your car and into every ordinary moment of your life that suddenly has no audience anymore. Thomas had been married for 4 years to a woman named Sandra. She was organized and composed, and in the weeks after the funeral she handled everything with a steadiness I could not have managed myself. She made calls. She filed paperwork. She coordinated the reception at the church hall and thanked people on my behalf when I couldn't find words. I remember standing at the reception thinking that my son had chosen wisely. I remember being grateful. That was 19 months before I stood at my kitchen counter in Sudbury holding a Hydro One bill for $312. I had asked Sandra about the cottage once, about 8 months after Thomas died. A gentle conversation I didn't want to push. She said she hadn't been able to bring herself to think about it yet. She said the memories were too raw. She said she needed more time. I told her to take all the time she needed. I told her there was no rush. I meant it. I was not going to be the difficult grieving father-in-law who made her loss harder than it already was. I gave her time. Someone had apparently been using that time to run up a $312 hydro bill at a cottage that was to be sitting empty. I did not call Sandra. I did not call anyone. I put the bill in my coat pocket, filled my travel mug, and got in my truck. The drive to Temagami from Sudbury is about 2 hours up Highway 69, and then north on 11. I have driven it so many times over the years that my hands know the turns before my eyes do. Thomas and I had made that drive together every summer, since he was old enough to carry his own tackle box. I drove it now in late November, with the sky the color of old pewter and the trees bare and the frost still on the fields at 10 in the morning, and I did not turn the radio on. I just drove. I turned off the main road onto the gravel track, about a kilometer from the water. The track winds to a stand of white birch before it opens up near the property, and I stopped my truck in the trees before the clearing, old habit from years of not wanting to spook the deer. I cut the engine and sat there. There were lights on in the cottage, not a timer light, not to ask what time dinner was, not to ask what I had forgotten. The main room windows were lit, and the kitchen, and I could see the glow of something. A television or a laptop, through the curtain on the side window facing the lake. There was a black SUV parked in the spot where Thomas always parked his truck. I did not recognize the vehicle. My chest was doing something I didn't have a name for. Not quite fear, not quite anger. Something older than both, the feeling of standing at the edge of something you cannot see the bottom of. And then I remembered something I had completely forgotten about for the better part of a year. Thomas had installed a security system at the cottage the summer before he died. 4 cameras, front door, back deck, driveway, and one covering the dock. He had set the whole thing up over a long weekend in July and walked me through it on a video call, showing me each camera angle. Proud of himself the way he always was when he built something properly, he had made me write down the login credentials in the small notebook I keep in my kitchen drawer, the one with the broken spiral where I write down passwords and birthdays and things I know I will forget. He made me write it down because, as he put it, "Dad, you're going to need it, and you're going to say you remember it and you won't." He was right. He was usually right. I still had that notebook at home. I did not approach the cottage. I sat in my truck in the birch trees in the November cold, and I took out my phone and I found the notebook photo I had taken of that page, because I learned years ago to photograph the pages of that notebook in case I lose it. I logged into the camera system. The live feed loaded slowly on my phone signal, but it loaded. The driveway camera showed the black SUV clearly, and beside it, 2 sets of boot tracks in the frost leading to the front door. The back deck camera showed a propane heater running on the deck, the kind you use when you want to sit outside in the cold. 2 folding camp chairs pulled close together, and a half-empty bottle of wine sitting on the railing. The front door camera showed a wreath on the door, evergreen branches and a gold ribbon, the kind of wreath someone hangs when they consider a place their own. I switched to the recorded footage. I went back 16 months. I sat in my truck in the birch trees in northern Ontario, and I watched my daughter-in-law's life. She had started bringing him up to the cottage within 6 weeks of the funeral. 6 weeks. I sat with that number for a long time before I could keep watching. His name, I eventually worked out from a piece of mane visible in one clip on the deck table, was Ryan. He was tall, mid-40s, with the easy, relaxed movement of someone who is never uncertain about where he is supposed to be. He moved through Thomas's cottage like he owned it. He cooked in Thomas's kitchen. He sat in Thomas's Muskoka chairs on the deck that Thomas had sanded and repainted the summer before he died. He pulled Thomas's canoe off the rack and paddled out onto the lake on a bright August morning, while Sandra sat on the dock and watched him go. And I watched that clip 3 times before I could move past it. I watched Ryan repaint the trim on the boathouse, a dark green, replacing the red cedar stain Thomas and I had put on together 4 summers ago on a hot Saturday, with a 12-pack of Molson and a brush each. I watched him install a new mailbox post at the end of the gravel drive, a different style than the one Thomas had set in concrete himself. Small replacements, quiet replacements, the kind of changes a person makes when they are moving into a place, not visiting it. I watched all of this for an hour in my truck. Then I drove home. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, and I wrote down everything I needed to understand. The cottage had been jointly owned by Thomas and Sandra. Under Thomas's will, which I had a copy of because he had given me one, his share of the property was to come to me in the event that the marriage dissolved or Sandra predeceased him. He had explained that to me himself when he made the will. He said, "Dad, I built half of that dock with your lumber and your time, and I want you to know it'll come back to you if anything ever goes sideways." I remember laughing at him. I remember saying nothing was going sideways. I remember he just shrugged and said, "Just so you know." What I did not know was what Sandra had been doing with her estate since his death. The next morning I called a lawyer named Patricia, who had handled some property matters for me years earlier when I was still running my contracting business. I told her about the hydro bill. I told her about the footage. I told her about the SUV and the wreath, and the man named Ryan repainting the boathouse trim. Patricia listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I have always respected about her. Then she said, "Don't reach out to Sandra yet. Don't let her know what you've seen. Send me everything you have." I sent her 74 video clips. Over the following 4 weeks, Patricia found several things. The property insurance on the cottage had been quietly changed. Thomas's name had been removed from the policy, and it had been reissued in Sandra's name only. A process that should have required estate documentation and coordination with the executor, which was me. I had received nothing, signed nothing, no one had called. The paperwork appeared to have been processed with a copy of the death certificate and a form I had never seen. The municipal property tax file for the cottage showed an application for title transfer had been submitted to the Ontario Land Registry, moving the property to sole ownership in Sandra's name, pending a court process that had been initiated without my knowledge or any notification to me as co-executor of Thomas's estate. The hydro and water accounts had been transferred out of the estate name and into Sandra's personal name 9 months earlier. She had not been sitting with her grief and her memories. She had been working. Quietly and carefully and piece by piece, she had been moving my son's cottage into her own name while telling me she couldn't bear to think about it. Patricia also found something else. She found that Ryan was not someone Sandra had met after the funeral. He was a former colleague of hers from a commercial real estate firm she had worked at before she moved to Thomas's company. Patricia found archived social media posts, deleted but recoverable through web archive tools, that showed Sandra and Ryan at a Blue Jays game in Toronto 14 months before Thomas died. Two of them. A photo she had posted and then removed, tagged with his name, with a caption I will not repeat here but that no married woman posts about a man who is just a colleague. I read that and I had to put the phone down and walk outside to my backyard and stand in the cold for a long time. I want to be honest with you about what those weeks were like, because I think you deserve honesty if you're going to stick with this story. There was grief in what I felt. There was anger, the clean white hot kind that is almost easier to carry than the other kinds. But underneath both of those things, there was something I did not know what to do with. A retroactive wrongness. The feeling of looking back at a photograph and suddenly seeing something in the background that you missed every other time you looked at it. I thought about Thomas on Highway 11 in February. I thought about icy conditions in the early morning. I thought about a transport truck drifting into a lane. I thought about the investigation that had taken 3 weeks and been closed without anyone asking me a single question. I did not say any of this to Patricia. Some things you hold until you know what shape they are. What I did say to Patricia was, I want every action taken against this estate documented. I want to know every option available to me under Ontario law. And I want to know what happens next. Patricia said, give me 3 weeks. I gave her 20 days. In those 20 days, I went back to the cottage twice, not to confront anyone. I was not ready for that, and Patricia had been clear that I should not be. The first time I went in the early morning, before anyone would be awake, and I sat in my truck in the birch trees, and I watched through binoculars as Ryan carried firewood from the woodpile to the cottage porch. Thomas's woodpile. Birch rounds. I had helped him split 2 autumns ago. I watched Ryan carry them like a man who had always owned this place. The second time I walked the property line along the north side through the trees, staying back from the clearing, and I took my own photographs. Not because Patricia needed them, because I needed to see it with my own eyes, on my own feet, on the same ground where Thomas had walked. Because Thomas had shown me where the osprey nested along that north shoreline, and I needed to be in the same place where he had stood when he showed me. I found something on that second visit I had not expected. At the dock, pulled up on the shore beside the boathouse, was a kayak I did not recognize. New or nearly new, a bright red touring kayak with a name written on the hull in black paint marker in careful block letters. The name was Sandra's maiden name. A kayak that had not been at that dock when Thomas was alive. A kayak that someone had brought to the property and labeled with her name as if she were claiming a locker at school. I photographed the serial number on the hull. Patricia ran it. The kayak had been purchased 11 months ago. It had been charged to a Visa account opened in the name of Thomas's estate. An account Patricia discovered that had been opened 4 months after his death, using estate documentation that had been submitted without my knowledge or authorization as co-executor. She had used credit opened in my dead son's estate name to buy herself a kayak, and she had brought it to his cottage, and she had painted her own name on the side of it. I remember hearing Patricia's voice on the phone when she told me that. Very level, the careful measured tone of someone who has finished building something and knows it will hold. She said, I think we're ready. We were ready. I won't walk you through the full legal process in detail because some of it is still ongoing and Patricia has asked me to keep certain specifics private. What I will tell you is what happened when everything was finally put in front of a judge. Patricia filed a comprehensive submission with the Ontario Superior Court of Justice, Estates Branch. It included the 74 video clips with their timestamps spanning 16 months. It included the insurance change documentation. It included the title transfer application and the process by which it had been initiated without my knowledge. It included the estate credit account records and the kayak purchase. It included a formal objection to the title transfer on the basis of Thomas's will provisions and my rights as co-executor. It included a demand for a full estate accounting. I was told Sandra received notification on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, her lawyer had called Patricia. By Friday afternoon, Sandra had called me. I let it go to voicemail. I sat in my kitchen chair, the one I have been sitting in for 22 years, the one with the worn patch on the armrest from my elbow. And I listened to her voice, a voice I had once thought of as belonging to someone who was family. I heard her say my name. I heard her say she could explain. I heard her say it wasn't what it looked like and that she had been meaning to call me and that things had gotten complicated. The message was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. I listened to all of it. Then I set the phone face down on the table and I poured myself a glass of water and I drank it standing at the sink looking out at the backyard where Margaret's lilac bushes still grow along the fence line, same as they always have. I did not call back. The hearing before the court took place 8 weeks later, in a room in Toronto that smelled of old carpet and central heating and the particular stillness of places where serious things are decided. The judge was a man in his early 60s with steel-rimmed glasses and the habit of writing notes while witnesses spoke without looking up. Patricia presented the evidence the way she does everything, methodically, without drama, in the correct order. The video footage, the financial records, the insurance documentation, the kayak registration, Thomas's will and the specific provisions I have already described to you. Sandra sat on the other side of the room with her own lawyer. She was dressed carefully. She kept her hands folded on the table and her expression very still. Ryan was not there. I had not expected him to be. At one point, the judge looked up from the kayak purchase records and looked across at Sandra's lawyer and said, "The account was opened 4 months after Mr. Thomas's death." Sandra's lawyer said, "Your Honor, my client." And the judge said, "I'm asking about the timeline," and wrote something down. The ruling came 13 days later. The title transfer application was voided. The estate credit account was frozen pending a complete audit. The insurance policy was ordered restored to its proper form, with the estate named correctly. An independent administrator was appointed to oversee the estate resolution. Sandra was ordered to vacate the cottage property within 45 days and to provide a full accounting of all estate funds used since Thomas's death. I was sitting in Patricia's office on Bay Street when she called me with the decision. The November light flat and grey outside the window. The kind of Toronto afternoon that makes the whole city look like it is waiting for something. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just sat there. Then I said, "What about the other thing?" Patricia knew what I meant. I had told her weeks earlier about what I had been thinking about at 2 in the morning. About Highway 11 in February. About icy conditions. About how quickly the file had been closed. About a photograph of 2 people at a baseball game. 14 months before one of them's husband died on an icy highway in the early morning. I hadn't asked her to do anything with it. I had just told her because I needed someone else to know it was there. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a different conversation. Different people. Not something I can pursue, but I know who you should speak to." She gave me a name and a number. I made the call the following week. I will not tell you what has come from that call. Not yet. It is ongoing, and I have been told to be patient. And patience is something that grief teaches you, whether you want to learn it or not. It teaches you that time does not move in a straight line. That some things take longer to come to the surface than you think. That the truth has a way of being patient in a way that the people hiding it simply cannot sustain. What I will tell you is that I have asked the question, and the question is now in the right hands, and I am holding it the way you hold a line on a cold morning on a northern Ontario lake. Enough tension to know something is there. Not so much that you break what you are holding. But I want to tell you about the cottage, because that part is finished, and it is the part that I go back to most often in my mind. After the legal proceedings, after Sandra had vacated and the estate was properly administered, the cottage on Lake Temagami came to me. Thomas had made sure of that, in his own careful way, planning for things he hoped would never happen. He had made sure I would have it. I drove up in late January, after the holiday season, when the lake was frozen solid, and the birch trees stood white against a white sky. I let myself in with the key Thomas had given me years earlier, the one that has been on my keychain ever since, and I stood in the front room for a while. Sandra had taken most of her own things. The furniture was largely still there. Thomas's furniture, the old leather couch he had hauled up in a borrowed trailer, the bookshelves he had built into the wall himself along the west side, still full of the books he had been meaning to read, and the ones he had read twice. His canoe paddles were still hanging on the hooks by the back door. I opened every window for 20 minutes, even though it was well below zero, because I needed the air to be different in there. The kayak named after Sandra had been impounded as part of the estate audit. In its place beside the boathouse, I had brought up the old aluminum canoe that Thomas and I had bought together at a garage sale in Barrie 17 years ago for $200. The one with the grey patch on the port side, from the time we hit a submerged rock on the Spanish River and had to portage the last 4 kilometers out in the rain. It needs a new thwart, and I have been meaning to fix it for 3 seasons. I tied it up at the dock with the rope Thomas had always used, the orange one, worn smooth at the cleats. I did not name the canoe anything. It doesn't need a name. We both know what it is. I have been going up to the cottage most weekends since then. There is always something that wants doing in a place like that. A section of top decking that has worked loose over the winter. A window latch that doesn't catch cleanly. The boathouse trim they try and painted that dark green, which I've since sanded back and repainted in the original red cedar stain, matching as closely as I could the color Thomas and I had put on together on that hot Saturday with the Molsons and the brushes. I met the neighbors on the property to the south in February, a retired couple from Timmins named Fred and Louise who have had their camp there for 30 years. They knew Thomas a little, from the way that people know each other in cottages in a row. Waves from docks, conversations over property lines in the early morning. Louise told me Thomas had brought over a plate of her lost cat once. She laughed when she said it, the way people do when they remember small kindnesses. I stood in the snow at the property line and I listened to her tell me that, and I was glad. One Saturday morning in March, I was out on the frozen lake before sunrise. I do that sometimes when I can't sleep. Walk out to the middle with a thermos and just stand there in the dark and the quiet and the cold, which sounds like a strange thing to do and probably is. The lake makes sounds when it's frozen, small cracks and groans, the ice talking to itself. And if you stand still long enough, it stops sounding eerie and starts sounding like breathing. I talked to Thomas that morning, not praying exactly, just talking the way you do when someone is gone, and the silence has been going on long enough that you stop being self-conscious about it. I told him about the court ruling. I told him about the canoe at the dock and the repainted boathouse. I told him about Fred and Louise and the story about the cat. I told him I was sorry it took me 16 months to open the main. The sky started going grey pink to the east while I was standing there, the kind of February dawn that comes up slowly in northern Ontario, taking its time, easing in. I stood on the ice with my coffee and I thought about my son. I thought about the camera system he installed on a July weekend because he was proud of his own work and wanted me to know where everything was, showing me each angle on a video call, patient with me when I didn't understand the app at first. He could not have known what he was setting up for me. He had no way of knowing. But he gave me the means to find the truth, set it up with his own hands and made me write down the password because he knew I would forget. That is not something I take lightly. I am 64 years old, and I have spent a lot of time in the last 19 months learning to take nothing lightly. There is still a question open that I cannot yet answer. There is still a call I made and a name Patricia gave me and a file that is somewhere in the hands of people I have to trust for now. I think about it most nights. I hold it the way I told you. But the cottage is mine. The canoe is at the dock. The boathouse is red cedar again. And every time I drive that 2 hours north on the 69 and turn onto the gravel track to the birch trees, I think about the hydro bill that sat in a pile of mail for 4 days while I ignored it. And I think about how close I came to throwing the whole stack away that Tuesday morning without looking. I think about how grief makes you want to put things off, to avoid one more envelope that might be another reminder. One more piece of admin that belongs to a life that isn't there anymore to manage. Open the mail. Drive to the house. Log into the camera. Thomas built things carefully. He thought ahead. He wrote things down and made sure the right people knew where they were. He did not leave me unprepared, even for the things neither of us knew were coming. The least I can do is be worthy of that. I keep coming back to the same thought, standing at the kitchen counter with my coffee going cold, the way it does when I get too far into my own head. Thomas was a careful man, not cautious in the way that comes from fear, but careful in the way that comes from paying attention. He checked his work. He wrote things down. He made sure the people he trusted knew where everything was, including the passwords to a camera system he installed on a July weekend, because he was proud of what he had built and wanted to share it with me. He could not have known what he was setting up, but the care he took in ordinary moments turned out to be the thing that protected everything that mattered. That is not luck. That is the consequence of how a person chooses to live. I have thought a lot, in the 19 months since I lost him, about what separates the people who leave good things behind from the people who don't. It is not money or status or whether life treated them fairly, because life did not treat Thomas fairly. It is something quieter than that. It is the habit of doing things properly even when no one is watching, of keeping your word, of making sure the people you love have what they need to go on without you, even when you have no reason to think they will need to. Thomas had that. He had it without ever making a show of it. I think that is the only kind of integrity that actually counts. The kind that shows up in the small decisions, the ones nobody applauds you for. And Sandra. I have thought about Sandra too, though it is a harder kind of thinking. What she did was not the result of one bad decision in a moment of weakness. It was a series of choices, made over months, each one requiring her to look at what she was doing and decide to keep going. The paperwork, the credit account, the kayak with her own name painted on the hull at my son's dock. Each of those things required thought and effort. She was not careless. She was deliberate. And that deliberateness, that willingness to keep choosing the wrong thing over and over when she had every opportunity to stop, is what brought the whole weight of it down on her in the end. Not because the universe keeps score in some mystical way, simply because actions accumulate, evidence exists, time keeps running, and the truth, as I have come to understand it, is more patient than any person who has something to hide. What carried me through the months between that hydro bill and the court ruling was not rage, though the rage was there. It was something more stubborn than that. It was the refusal to give up on what Thomas had built. Even when sitting with grief made every practical step feel like lifting something too heavy. There were mornings I did not want to make the calls, did not want to read the documents Patricia sent over, did not want to think about any of it. I made the calls anyway. I read the documents. I drove back up to the cottage a second time and walked the property line in the court, because I needed to stand on the same ground Thomas had stood on and see it for myself. That stubbornness, if that is what it is, that willingness to keep going through the exhaustion and the loss, is the only thing I had to offer. It turned out to be enough. I am 64 years old. I have buried my wife and my son. I have learned, later in life than I would have liked, that the most important things you can carry through this world are the quality of your own choices, the clarity of your thinking when things go wrong, and the will to stay with something that matters even when staying is hard. Thomas knew that. He taught it to me without ever sitting me down and saying so. The canoe is at the dock. The boathouse is red cedar again. That is enough for now.